We're on DAF BAYT Aleph in Masechet SUKKAH. We learned that yesterday that a SUKKAH that is higher than 20 amos is pasul according to the Chachamim, but according to Rabbi Yehuda it is kosher. So the Gemara's question at this point is, it's about a dozen lines from the top. Minahani mili, where do you know this from? Amar Rabba da Amar Kra. So we're going to see multiple opinions today. Rabbi says it's based on a pasuk. Laman yedu doroseichem ki vasukos oshafti es b'nei Yisrael. That it's important for your generations to know that I placed you in Sukkot. So ad esrim ama adam yodeya shehu dor b'sukkah. Lamayla me esrim ama ein adam yodeya shedor b'sukkah mishum delo shalta ba'ena. So Rabbi says what I look in this pasuk is that it's totally in cognition. That a person has to be able to be cognizant of the fact when he's sitting in the sukkah that what it is a sukkah. When the ceiling is higher than 20 amos, you're not cognizant of the fact that you're living in a sukkah because the ceiling is too high. You can't really see it. And that's the reason why the Chachamim say that it's not kosher. Rabbi Zera, so that's the first opinion. Let's try and keep track of the opinions. The first one is Rabba. The second one is Rabbi Zera. He says, Amar Mehacha, he says it's from here. V'sukkah tihiyeh litzel yomam mechorev. So there's a pasuk in Yeshaya that talks about what's going to happen when Mashiach comes. That God says that there will be a canopy of protection or of shade that'll be to protect the Jewish people from the daylight and from the cold. So ad esrim ama adam yoshev b'tzeil sukkah. Lamayla me esrim ama ed adam yoshev b'tzeil sukkah. What you see from this pasuk is that a sukkah has to provide shade. What is a sukkah? The inherent component, the mainstay component of a sukkah is its tzchach. That's why it's called tzchach, because it's socha. It is the protective cover of the sukkah. Now, if you have a sukkah that's higher than 20 amos, the shade is not coming from the tzchach. The shade is coming from the walls. And that's why it's not a kosher sukkah, according to the Chachamim. Ela b'tzeil defanos, but rather it's coming from the wall. So, Amar le Abaya ela me'ata, ha'osa sukkaso be'ashtaros karnayim ha'chanami delo havi sukkah. So Abaya says, by that argument, you're telling me that when the shade does not come from the schach, it's not a kosher sukkah. What if I make my sukkah in a valley called Ashtaros Karnayim, which was a known valley which was surrounded by mountains? It was always shady there because the mountains provided natural shade. So you're telling me that because the shade is not coming from my schach, but rather the surrounding mountains, it's a pasul, a sukkah? So Amar lei hasam, no. He says, no, that's not a good analogy. He says, because over there, dal ashtaros karnayim ikatzel sukkah. Hacha dal defanos lekatzel sukkah. He says, if you were to imagine that the mountains disappeared, you'd still have a sukkah that the schach is providing the majority of the shade. But if you imagine the walls that are 20 amos high missing, you no longer have a sukkah. In other words, all you have is a ceiling, the whole thing falls down and all the sunlight's coming in from the bottom. It's not a sukkah anymore. So it's true that you could have surrounding things on the outside of the sukkah that could also provide shade, but as long as the sukkah is capable of, the schach is capable of providing shade, that's what makes it a kosher sukkah. But if structurally the schach is not capable of providing shade because the walls predominate, so then it's not a kosher sukkah. So that's our second opinion. That's Rabbi Zera as to why a 20 amma high sukkah is not kosher. V'Rava, now we have a third opinion, which is Rava. He says, Mehacha, Basukos teishvu shivas yomim. The Torah says you shall live in sukkahs for 7 days, and the implication is only 7 days. It's not meant for you to live in it longer. So Amra Torah kol shivas hayomim tsemi diras keva v'shev b'diras Aryai. So ad esrim amma adam osa dirasu diras Aryai. L'mayla me esrim amma ein adam osa dirasu diras Aryai. So the argument is the Torah wants you to live in a temporary dwelling. When you make a structure that's higher than 20 amos, you are perforce going to create a sturdy structure because you have to lay a foundation, you have to firmly entrench the walls so that they don't collapse under the weight and under the physics of a 20 amma high wall. So therefore, by definition, that's not called a temporary structure. That's not called a diras Aryai. and that's why it's not kosher. So the eladiras keva, that's called a permanent structure. So Amar le Abaye elameata asa mechitzo shel barzel v'sicha chal gaben hachanami delo havi sukkah. So Abaye says if your argument is that it's not a temporary structure because it's too sturdy, what if a person makes a really sturdy sukkah that's less than 20 amos? He makes it out of iron walls. Right? Are you going to tell me that's not a kosher sukkah because it's too sturdy? So Amar lei hachi kaim nalach. No, you don't understand. This is what I mean to say. Ad chaf amad adam osa dirasu diras arai ki avid le diras keva nami nafik. L'mayla michaf amad adam osa dirasu diras keva ki avid le diras arai nami lo nafik. What I mean to say is as follows. Conceptually, you can make, when you make a structure that's less than 20 amos, it can either be made flimsily or it can be made very sturdily. So therefore, since it's possible to make it into a diras arai, when you make it into a diras kev, it's still a kosher sukkah. But when something's higher than 20 amos, just the engineering doesn't even allow you to make it into a diras arai, a temporary structure, a flimsy structure, and therefore, no matter how you construct it, it's just simply not going to be kosher. Okay. So now the Gemara says we have three different opinions. Let's just review so that we're clear on our opinions. Opinion number one is Rabbi, and he says you can't see the ceiling, so it's not you're not even cognizant of the fact that you're in a sukkah. Reason number two, the primary shade when the walls are so high is from the walls and not from the SUKKAH. And reason number three, it's not a diras arai, it's not a temporary dwelling, it's a permanent dwelling. So the question is, why is there this machlokas? In other words, clearly each one of these opinions disagrees with the other two. So now we're going to just explain why each opinion disagrees with the other two. Kulhu kirabba lo amri, the other two opinions disagree with Rabba, who says that it's from Laman Yedu Dorosechem, that you have to be cognizant of the fact that you're living in a sukkah, is because hahu yedia lidoros hu he. He says when the Torah says that your generation should know that that I placed you in Sukkot, does not mean that you have to be presently cognizant that you can, or meaning that you can see the SUKKAH. That's not what the pasuk is trying to imply. The pasuk is saying that when you teach your children about the history of the Jewish people, make sure that you tell them that when we were traveling in the desert, God protected us under the anane hakavod, under the clouds of glory. That's what the pasuk means. It's got nothing to do with the halachic issues of how high how visible the ceiling has to be. And Rabbi Zera namilo amri hahu liyamos hamashiach hu dichsiv. The reason why the other two disagree with Rabbi Zera, who says, based on the pasuk in Yeshaya, that the shade has to come primarily from the SUKKAH and not from the walls. See, they said that's not a good pasuk. He says because that pasuk is not talking about a halachic issue about sukkahs. It's talking about God's. It's a metaphor. It's a figurative pasuk of God providing us with protection when Mashiach comes. That's really all the pasuk is saying. So the Gemara says, "Reb Zera imkein lema krav chuppatiya litzel yomam umay v'sukkatiya litzel yomam shamas mina tarte." But Reb Zera will tell you if it's only meant figuratively, then the prophet could have used the word chuppah, which also implies a protective canopy. Why did he use the halachic term sukkah? It's to teach me both what's going to happen in Yemos HaMashiach that will feel secure, and it's also telling me a halachic issue about the laws of sukkah, which means that the primary shade has to come from the SUKKAH and not from the walls. Now, Tarte Kirava Namilo Amri Mishum Koshia de Abaya. And the other two don't hold like the last opinion, which was the opinion of Rava, who, and remember, what did Rava say? Anything that's higher than 20 amos is a permanent structure. So Abaya had challenged Rava, and Abaya had said, well, by that argument, if you make iron walls, if you make an iron sukkah, that also shouldn't be kosher. So that's why the other two don't just feel that conceptually that doesn't make any sense. Now Rava had a response to that challenge of Abaya, but we can still at least understand why there is some potency to Abaya's challenge, which is why the other two sides wouldn't agree with Rava's opinion. Now, Keman Azla Hada Amar Reb Yoshia Amar Rav. Now we're going to see another three opinions about different halachas of sukkah. Now I just want to point out that all three of these rabbis that we're going to be quoting now quote their Rebbe Rav. And like Rashi says many times, three students are in the same shir and they hear three different things. I don't know if you heard my drasha this Shabbos. I said, I know I'm going to be misquoted, right? It happens all the time. I don't feel bad. If they could misquote Rav, they can misquote anybody. So,
they're listening, please.
Right. So anyway, there are three different students, all hearing Rav, and each one hears something different. Okay, so let's see what Rav Yoshia says in the name of Rav. Machlokes b'she'ein defanos magios l'schach, aval defanos magios l'schach afilu l'mayla me'esrim ama kishera. That his understanding was that the only time, according to Rav, the only time there's a machlokas between the Chachamim and Rebbe Yehuda is when the walls do not reach up to the schach. Meaning that it's very common when you have a very high ceiling. You've all been in sukkahs like this, where the wall has to start at the floor, but it doesn't have to go up to the schach. It only has to go up technically 10 tfachim, and it's still a kosher sukkah. So that even let's say you have posts, or let's say you have a gazebo outside, right? And the gazebo has schach on top, and you just put walls around it, but the walls are only up like this high. So that's still a kosher sukkah. That's the only time where there's a machlokas between the Chachamim and Rebbe Yehuda, only when the walls do not go all the way up to the ceiling. But if the walls go all the way up to the ceiling, then even the Chachamim agree that if it's higher than 20 amos, it's kosher. Aval defanos magios l'schach afilu l'mayla me'esrim ama keshera. And the reason is, why? So the answer must be that it has to do with the way that the eye travels. When the eye sees a wall, and the wall goes all the way up to the ceiling, so the eye will follow the path of the wall, and it'll eventually see the schach on top. So therefore, it must be kiman keraba da'amri mishum de lo shalta ba'ena v'kibin de defanos magios l'schach mishla shalta ba'ena. So it must be that Rabbi Yoshia holds like the first opinion as to what the issue with a 20 amma high sukkah is. It has to do with the visibility of the schach and the cognition that you're in a sukkah. But if the walls go all the way up to the schach, you do have visibility of the schach. You are cognizant of the fact that you're in a sukkah. So therefore, even the Chachamim would agree that it's kosher. Now let's look at another opinion. Kaman azlaha da'amar Rav Huna amar Rav. Now Rav Huna, quoting Rav, says that there's a different issue. Machlokes b'she'ein ba'ela arba amos al arba amos. Aval yesh ba yoser me arba amos al arba amos. Afilu lamala me esrim ama keshera. That Rav Huna says in the name of Rav that the only time that there's a machlokes is when the sukkah is 4 amos by 4 amos in its floor space, or less, or smaller. But if the horizontal dimensions of the sukkah are larger than 4 by 4, so then even the Chachamim would agree that if it's more than 20 amos high, it's still kosher. Now the question is, why would that be? Why would that be? It must have something to do with the ability for the shade to come from the ceiling instead of coming from the walls once the sukkah is sufficiently wide. Yes? So therefore, we must conclude kiman kerebi zera da'amar mishum tzeilhu v'kevin deravicha ikat tzeil sukkah. So the answer is because it's got to do with the shade that's being provided. We said that the problem with something that's higher than 20 amos, according to Reb Zera, is because the shade is primarily from the walls and not from the ceiling. But if the sukkah is really large, it's like a big atrium, so then even if the walls are very, very high, you'll still be getting a lot of shade from the schach itself, because the walls will not be the primary source of shade since it's such a large area. So therefore, it must be that this Rav Huna must be holding like the second opinion as the reason why a 20 amma sukkah is possible according to the Chachamim, and therefore, if it's sufficiently wide, if it's sufficiently spacious, so then the Chachamim would agree that if it's higher than 20, it's still kosher.
So this has nothing to do with the angle you're perceiving. Maybe in a small sukkah, when you look up, it's different than if you have more of a view, when you're in a big sukkah and you can see the walls and you can see the schach,
It doesn't depend on the position of the individual.
The shade. It has nothing to do with the position of the individual who's looking.
No, it has to do with the room itself, with the entire room.
The shadow.
Whenever you're standing right by the wall of the sukkah, you perceive that the shade is primarily from the wall. But if you're standing in the center of the sukkah, that's the criterion. Now, Kiman az lahada amar Rav Chanan bar Rabba Amar Rav, machlokas b'shena machzekes el kedei roshu v'rubo v'shulchano. Aval machzekes yosem ichdei roshu v'rubo v'shulchano afilo ma'ilo me'esrim ama keshera. So there, now we see a third opinion, and he says something very similar to the previous opinion. But he says the Chachamim agree that if it's higher than 20 amos, it's kosher, provided that it's larger than Rosho Verubo Vishulchano, which means that the only time the Chachamim say that the sukkah is possible when the walls are higher than 20 amos is if the sukkah is so small that you can't even get your table and the majority of your body into the sukkah. In other words, it's not functional as a sukkah where you can sit down and have the meal. But if it's larger than that, which the Gemara will say later on is 7 by 7 tfachim, it's like a really small sukkah. If it's larger than that, then the Chachamim would agree that if the walls are higher than 20 amos, it's kosher. So keman de lo kechad. So who does that opinion go like? Like, what's the basis for that? It's not that the basis can't be as far as visibility of the ceiling. The basis is not as far as visibility of shade, because we just established that the visibility as far as shade is concerned is accomplished as long as it's wider than 4 by 4, not wider than just 7 by 7 tfachim. So the Gemara says the lo kechad. We don't know the reason. We don't know the reason of this opinion, and we're not really sure what the logic is. We have confidence that the rabbi who said this, Rav Chanan bar Rabba, would be able to explain it to us if he was here, but we don't know what his reason is. We don't understand why he would make that distinction between Roshu Verubo V'Shulchano versus larger than Roshu Verubo V'Shulchano.
Isn't this opposed to Dalet al Dalet? Rav said both, and they can't be both, right? He's saying a smaller shear than Dalet al Dalet.
Right, that's correct. That's why I said you have 3 students quoting Rav differently. That's
the others didn't contradict. In other words, they had different reasons.
Yes,
this one
but
contradicts
this student contradicts the previous student. Exactly. The previous student, Rav Huna, said in the name of Rav that if it's larger than Dalet al Dalet, then it can be higher than 20 amos, even according to the Chachamim. And Rav Chanan bar Rabba says, no, that's not what Rav said. He said if it's larger than Roshu Verubo V'Shulchano, then it could be higher than 20 amos, according to the Chachamim. Yes, clearly there's a difference of opinion as to what Rav said. Okay, so now the Gemara says, Bishlama de Rav Yoshia pliga ad Rav Huna v'Rav Chanan bar Rabba de'inu kol yavi shira b'mashcha v'iu lo kol yahiv shira b'mashcha. It's clear that Rav Yoshia, and what his area of disagreement with the other 2 rabbis is that Rabbi Yoshia says that there's absolutely no criterion whatsoever as far as the spaciousness of the sukkah's floor, of the floor plan of the sukkah. He holds that it's all dependent upon whether the walls go up to the ceiling or not. That's clear that that's the way he understood the shir from his Rebbe. So that's the machlokas between Rabbi Yoshi and the other 2. Ela Rav Huna v'Rav Chanan bar Rabba nema behechsher sukkah kamifli, but it's a little bit harder to discern what the machlokas is between the latter 2, Rav Huna and Rav Chanan bar Rabba. One says that if it's larger than 4 by 4, it's kosher, and the other one says if it's larger than Roshu Verubo V'Shulchano, it's kosher. So what are they arguing about? The Gemara says, let us perhaps suggest that the machlokas is what is the minimal shear of a sukkah? Demar savar hechsher sukkah ba'arba amos, umar savar hechsher sukkah b'machzekes Roshu Verubo V'Shulchano. Maybe that's the machlokas. In other words, both rabbis agree that Rav, when he gave shir, said that according to the Chachamim, the only time 20 amos is possible is when you only have the minimal shear of sukkah. But when you have larger than the minimal shear of sukkah, the walls could be higher than 20 amos. And the machlokas between the 2 is, what is the minimal shear of sukkah? So Rav Huna says the minimal shear of sukkah is 4 by 4, and Rav Chanan bar Rabba says the minimal shear of sukkah is Rosho Verubo V'Shulchano, just as long as you can fit in. So the Gemara says, lo, no, that's not the machlokas. The Kuli Alma Hechsha Sukkah Rosho Verubo V'Shulchano. Maybe I'll argue that everyone agrees that the minimal shear is that 7 by 7 tfachim, that really tiny sukkah. But v'hacha miflgi demar saver b'machzekes Roshu Verubo V'Shulchano pligi avol yoser meroshu Verubo V'Shulchano divrei kol kesheira. that the last opinion of Rav Chanan bar Rabba says that the only time that there's a that he heard from Rav, that the only time that there's a machlokas is when you have the minimal shear of Roshu Veruba V'Shulchano. But if it's larger than that minimal shear, then it's kosher even when the walls are higher than 20 amos, according to everyone. Umar Savra Meroshu Veruba V'Shulchano Adalat Amos Pliyi Avol Yosem Idalat Amos Divrei Kol Keshera. And Rav Huna heard it differently from Rav. He heard from Rav to say that even if it's larger than a minimal shear, it'll still be possible according to the Chachamim until it's larger than Dalet al Dalet, until it's larger than 4 by 4 amos. So therefore, you can't deduce that there's a machlokas as to what the minimal shear of sukkah is. The machlokas has to do with what actually they heard from Rav say in shear, as far as when the Chachamim hold that higher than 20 amos is kosher. Meisvei. So now we're going to challenge what we've just said as far as these minimal shiurim. We're going to, as far as the spaciousness of the sukkah, from the following brisa. Sukkah shehi gavoa lamayla me'esrim amma pisula. So the brisa just says that according to the Chachamim, a sukkah that's higher than 20 amos is possible. Rabbi Yehuda machshir adaborim v'chamishim amma. And Rabbi Yehuda says it's kosher, even if the walls are much higher, even if they're 40 or even 50 amos high, it's still kosher. So Amar Rabbi Yehuda then says, let me prove it to you. Ma'isa behilni hamalka belod, shahaisa sukasa gavoa me'esrim amma. In our mission in December, we went to the city of Lod, and they told us that this was a big, even though Lod today is a very depressed area with a lot of drug addiction and stuff like that, in the old days, in the times of the Second Temple, it was a place of great Hasmonean wealth. And there was a queen whose name was Hilni Hamalka. She was from the Hasmonean family, and she was a frum woman. She observed all of halacha. She had a sukkah that was higher than 20 amos. So Rabbi Yehuda says, you see from there, and the rabbis would come and visit her, wish her a good yontif, and they never objected that her sukkah was much higher. So Amrulo Misham Raya Isha Haisa Patur Min HaSukkah. So the rabbi said back to him, what's the proof from there? Women are exempt from the mitzvah of sukkah, so why should they object? She could be living in a bunker, it wouldn't make a difference. It's she's patur from sukkah. So Amar Lahen Va'alo Shiva Banim Havula Va'od Kol Ma'aseh Lo Asaseh Lo Pi Chachamim. So Rabbi Yehuda says back to them, but wait a minute, she had 7 sons. So if she had 7 sons, she had to make a kosher sukkah for them. And furthermore, she always listened to the rules of the Chachamim. So the Gemara asks a question, Lama li lamisni va'od kol ma'aseh lo aseh el pi Chachamim. What does that last phrase mean? That she always acted according to the words of the rabbis. So, Hachi Kamer Lahu. What Rabbi Yehuda was saying to them is as follows. Ki tomru banim kitanim hayu. Maybe you'll tell me, yes, it's true she had 7 sons, but they were all under bar mitzvah. Okay, ukatanim piturim min sukkah, and therefore they're patur from the mitzvah of sukkah. And that's why they didn't protest. But wait a minute. But if she had 7 sons, so at the very least, the oldest one got to be about 8 years old, right? At the very least. And once you're 8 years old, you're not constantly tugging at your mother, but you don't need to nurse from her anymore. You have some level of independence. And maybe, so fine, once you're 8 years old, you've reached the age of chinuch. And there's a mitzvah derabanan of teaching a child how to do mitzvahs. So that's enough of a reason why she had to make a kosher sukkah. But maybe you'll tell me, no, that's only a rabbinic law. And maybe Hilni Hamalka did not heed rabbinic law, she only followed biblical law. So therefore, Tashma va'od kol ma'aseh lo asasa el al pi chachamim. And that's why Rabbi Yehuda had to add, she followed to a T all of the requirements of Chazal. She followed Torah Sheba'al Peh, she followed all rabbinic edicts, and therefore, if the sukkah was higher than 20 amos, it must be proof that a sukkah is kosher even when it's higher than 20 amos. So now the Gemara says, okay, let's go back to the story. So Bishlam Lamanda Omar Bishain Defanos Magios Leschach Machlokes. So remember, the Chachamim argue and they say, no, Hilni Hamalka, right, we disagree. We still hold that the sukkah has to be less than 20 amos high. So what's Rabbi Yehuda's challenge from Hilni Hamalka? If you hold that the Chachamim agreed to Rabbi Yehuda when the walls go all the way up to the ceiling, so the only way that Rabbi Yehuda could present this as a challenge to the Chachamim is if, in this case, by Hilni, the walls did not go up to the ceiling. Well, that makes sense, because, you know why? Because Darka Shel Malka, Leishev B'Sukkah, Shein Tefanos, Magiach L'Schach, Mishum Avira. That's normal. When a queen, when you're royalty, you want to make a sukkah with ventilation, because, you know, when you live in the Middle East or California, you want your sukkah to be well ventilated. It's not like in Toronto, where you want your sukkah to be like a fortress because it's bitterly cold outside. It's this inhumanly cold outside, right? Where people aren't even supposed to live, right? So if, you know, that's why, but if you live in the Middle East, right, then you understand why you'd have a sukkah that has ventilation on top. So that's why the walls didn't go all the way up to the ceiling. So that's why I understand that this is a formidable challenge to the Chachamim, right? Because they hold that if the walls don't go all the way up to the top, so then it's a problem when it's higher than 20 amos. And that's why they said, the Rabbi Yehuda says to them, well, then how do you justify only a malka? Elu leman domer basukkah ketana machlokes, v'chi darka shel malka leishev basukkah ketana. But according to the other opinion, which is that only if it's smaller than 4 by 4 amos are high walls problematic because of the shade issue. But come on, Hilni Hamalka had a small sukkah. She didn't have a small sukkah. She was the queen. She had servants. She had children. She obviously had to have a very spacious sukkah, in which case, what kind of challenge is Rabbi Yehuda presenting to the Chachamim? According to that opinion, the Chachamim agree that when it's a spacious sukkah, the walls can be much higher. So what's the challenge in the first place? So Amar Rabba bar Rav Ada lo nitzracha elo l'sukkah ha'asuya kitonios. The answer is that, okay, granted, she must have had a spacious sukkah, but maybe it was made into cubicles, you know, so that everyone would have like a little cubicle. In which case, if you were, even if your sukkah is very spacious on the outside, but if there's cubicles on the inside, so then the walls of the cubicle are going to prevent the shade from the schach, and the primary shade will still be from the sides and not from the top. And that's why it's objectionable to the Chachamim. So the Gemara says, "V'chidarka shel malka leishev b'sukkah asuya kitonios." Kitonios. Wait a minute. You think a queen is going to sit in the sukkah that's made out of cubicles? Come on, cubicles are only for lower level employees, right? But if you're a queen, you don't have a sukkah that's just like little cubicles. You have a spacious atrium. So the Gemara says, "Amar Ravashi lo nitzracha ela lekitonios sheba." No, the answer is you're right. Hilni Malka must have had a very spacious sukkah, and the main atrium was, you know, spacious for a queen, but there were also cubicles that were there for privacy. So Rabbanan Savri Baneha Basuka Ma'al Yahavu Yasvi V'ihu Yasva Bikitonios Mishum Tzniusa Umishum Hachi Lo Amri Lo Davar. So the Chachamim look at the situation and they say, look, granted Hilni Hamalka may have had some cubicles in her sukkah, but the fact of the matter is that her sons, who needed the sukkah, they were probably running around in the atrium part, and she, after spending all day with her 7 little pitzalach, needed some privacy. So she went into the cubicle at the end of the day. So if there was any problem of someone in a cubicle with a very narrow wall, you know, very tall walls and a very small space, it was only Hilni. And since Hilni is a woman, she's patur from sukkah. So what's the problem? You can't bring a raya from her case. Rabbi Yehuda savar baneha gaba havu yasvi v'afilo hachilo amri lo davar. So, and Rabbi Yehuda says, no, come on. Even the 8-year-old kid probably spent time with his mother in her small cubicle. And if that's the case, then it was wrong for her to create a sukkah that was so high and that had a cubicle of such confined space, because then the shade primarily comes from the walls and not from the ceiling. And that's why Rabbi Yehuda says, this is a challenge to you Chachamim, and it proves that the sukkah can be higher than 20 amos. Have a wonderful day, everyone.